I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close-Up. This week, we'll revisit my discussion with fellow New York Times journalist Dan Barry about the life and writings of the late Jimmy Breslin. But first, writing for New York Times Opinion, my next guest explains how property taxes have historically favored the rich while impoverishing blacks. Andrew Karl, professor of history and African American studies at the University of Virginia. He's also the author of the forthcoming The Black Tax, 150 Years of Theft, Exploitation, and Dispossession in America. That book coming out later this month. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us. Why is this, as you say it is in the opinion piece of the Times, the most powerful and stealthy engine of racism and wealth inequality? Why racism rather than classism?
Well, it is an element of classism as well, but I think the racial component of this comes in when you start looking at what the source of property tax revenue is based on, which is based on housing markets. And housing markets have, certainly in the 20th century and still today, worked in ways to disadvantage African Americans, both in devaluing their properties, as well as, sort of contributing to the segregation within housing markets and also within schools and in public services. And so when you combine those two, it becomes a sort of interlocking force that reproduces inequality, and it has a racial dimension to it.
And is this true all over the United States? Is it true in big cities like New York, suburban, and in the South as well?
Yeah, I mean, this is really what we've been, studies have been conducted recently that have shown that, nationwide African-American neighborhoods and homeowners are being overassessed between 10 and 12% relative to value. And we also know that nationwide, 97% of all U.S. counties have effectively regressive property tax systems, meaning that lower value properties are assessed at a higher percentage of their value than higher value properties. I mean, so that's almost universal. And again, if you combine that with the fact that Black-owned homes, Black neighborhoods are devalued because of race, that they appreciate at a slower rate than white neighborhoods, and you put those two together, and then you have what is a regressive tax becomes, in effect, a racist tax.
Is this a deliberate thing, or is this a thing that has become historic and gone on, or what is the origin of it? What's the genesis of it?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I sort of lay out both in the piece and I elaborate on in my book, is that we have a sort of long history both of intentional discrimination, and there's still elements of that certainly in many locales, but really now it's very much kind of baked into the structure of both the assessment process and the way in which you have different tax bases with different capacities that in turn lead to different communities paying much more to provide the services that their constituents need versus others. And both of those work to disadvantage low-income communities as well as African Americans in particular. But I think one thing that's important is that there many of the sort of elements of local tax assessments that allow for intentional discrimination remain in place, and there's been little to address at the national level, the local discretionary powers that assessors enjoy, as well as the incentives they might have to assess some property higher than others.
Is this a problem in New York City as well? We think in New York City property tax is relatively low, certainly compared to the suburbs. Is this something we're not dealing with here too?
Yeah, this is, I mean, I show throughout my research in the book, I mean, that there's been many studies that have shown over the years that low-income and African-American neighborhoods in New York City are being assessed at higher effective rates than wealthier ones. And we've certainly seen, in the New York Times has covered on numerous occasions, just the scandalous underassessment of some of the highest valued residential properties in the city. And I think it's always important to remember that, when some properties are underassessed, that means that others are overassessed. It's all relative in terms of the way, because ultimately that shrinks the tax base, and it shifts the tax burden onto those who are not getting that kind of favorable treatment.
Now, you said in that opinion piece in the Times that there are technical solutions that could be applied here. Why aren't they, and what are some of those solutions?
Yeah, there's been attempts, and I think in very laudable efforts at the local level. Cook County in particular elected a reform assessor in 2017 who kind of came in and began implementing ways of more accurately assessing properties at the local level, at the neighborhood level, because oftentimes you can see, and this is especially the case, say, in gentrifying neighborhoods, where you would see, say, a new development going up along next to, say, older properties and people who've been living in that community maybe on fixed incomes for generations. And then that higher value property becomes the basis for reassessing all the properties in that neighborhood in a way that sends taxes escalating. There's ways to begin to kind of more accurately capture the value of properties both at the block level. The problem, though, is that this is entirely up to to do so at the national scale would require a movement in every one of those taxing districts around the country. Pretty monumental challenge if we want to actually ensure that every community and every local taxpayer is going to be treated fairly.
So you propose that there's a much better solution.
Well, I think that today, especially the overassessment of lower income neighborhoods, the way in which the tax burden is often shifted onto the poor through these kind of administrative practices, the way in which poor communities have smaller tax bases that require them to tax their constituents more to get less. All of these are downstream effects of the defunding of local governments at the federal and state level that's been going on for decades, and the kind of pushing the responsibility for generating the kind of revenue that counties, cities, and towns need to provide these essential public services, public education, parks, streets, sidewalks, public libraries, all the things that local governments provide to their communities are dependent upon this tax source. And in many places just simply do not have the means to be able to provide them in a way that is anyway comparable to wealthier communities.
So the solution is what?
Well, I think that we should start thinking about having a permanent federal fiscal equity program like every other federated nation in the world has, that ensures that no county or city will lack the revenue that they need to provide the services that their constituents need and have come to expect. And so I think that's one thing to begin, that we need to start having this conversation around permanent solutions to what are these real sort of glaring inequities between places, not just amongst people within places.
And we can expect Congress to go along with this immediately, right?
Well, you got to start somewhere, and you got to sort of, initiate that conversation and begin to sort of, for one, recognize that there are other ways to do this, that, our federated fiscal structure was built over time and built through, choices, decisions, as well as just, sort of structural features within our tax system that have now put us at this place where we have, poor communities and within localities, poor and disadvantaged taxpayers being forced to shoulder much heavier burdens. And that, is something that we need to sort of, recognize and begin to open up a debate over ways to address these problems.
Andrew Karl, the author of The Black Tax, from the opinion pages of the New York Times. And coming up next, we revisit my discussion with friend and colleague Dan Barry about the newspaper columnist and author Jimmy Breslin. Picture the quintessential newspaper reporter and you'll conjure up Dan Barry or Jimmy Breslin. A master storyteller and shoe-leather newshound, he enthralled his readers writing about politics, social issues, the lives of ordinary citizens and their working-class neighborhoods. I was friends with Jimmy, and so was my Times colleague Dan Barry. He just edited a collection of Jimmy's essential writings for the Library of America. Dan, you point out that Jimmy, who died at 88 in 2017, worked for 5 decades at the Herald Tribune, the Long Island Press, the New York Post, Daily News, Journal American, and Newsday. They are either no longer in existence or shadows of themselves. What does that say about journalism in New York City?
That it's finding different avenues to provide information and elucidation. I think because, even the New York Times is driven mostly by digital. Most people consume the New York Times through their mobile app, their iPhone. And so I think it's just changing how information is being shared. On the other hand, you could argue that there are fewer voices, fewer large voices out there. It's not like you go to the newsstand anymore and see 6, 7 different newspapers there and you pick 3 or 4 and you have different voices. That's not happening as much.
Could a voice like Jimmy's, which was a very powerful voice, to read, to have impact on policy, to have impact on people's feelings, could a voice like that thrive in this environment? Or did you have to read it, hold it in your hand? Did you have to feel that tactile? Or digitally, does it just sort of vanish into the ozone?
That's a pretty existential question.
Yes,
Sam.
it is.
And
you're just the guy to ask.
I think that when you think of Breslin, you do think of like reading the Daily News or New York Newsday while you're sitting on the 2 train or something like that. And I wonder if voices are muted a little bit because they're being experienced through the digital world. But I think Breslin stood alone. And it'd be interesting, of course. I would love to hear what he would say about the Trump presidency and now the Trump pursuit of a second term. Breslin really held Trump in contempt back in the day and called his bluff way before anyone else.
Right, he saw it early on.
He did.
There are 67 columns in this book, 6 magazine pieces, 2 books, short books. In the book, Jimmy Breslin, Essential Writings. How'd you pick them out? How'd you choose them?
I really just sat in my office and read pretty much all of them. And, he was writing sometimes 4 and 5 times a week. Mm-hmm. And I remember Frank Klein's telling me once, if you're hitting 400, you're doing very well. In other words, 2 out of 5 is good. Breslin, I think, was hitting way higher than that, but not all of them were outstanding. Mm-hmm. Some of them were meeting a deadline and, feeding the dragon. And so, 50 years, 60 years of writing, there's a lot to read and consume. And then, to my mind, columns rose to the top. If he's visiting Joey Gallo's grandmother in her apartment in President Street in 1963, that rises to a different level. And you don't see that kind of journalism anymore, by the way. But when he would do that, he was at his best.
Why don't you see that kind of journalism anymore? I mean, people are smart, people are good writers, people have passion, people have more outlets now, arguably, than they ever did before. Why don't you see that kind of journalism?
I don't know. I would look at it through the prism of New York City, because we would have many journalistic rogues wandering the city and walking up and down tenement stairs looking for stories, and you don't see that as much anymore. I don't know. I think maybe perhaps we're too busy, or there's too much information coming from other avenues. I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't mind doing that again. So would you.
So would I. Jimmy said it was all about a 4-letter word, W-O-R-K, and he did. And some people said, well, didn't he make this stuff up? Was it true or was it truth? But he rode all over the city, not driving himself, and walked up those tenement stairs and went all over the place and talked to these real people. And do people do that anymore?
I do.
I talk to dead people now, writing obituaries.
Well, the way Breslin would work, by the way, is, as you know, he would begin working the phones at 6 o'clock in the morning, calling up judges and politicians.
Tell me about it.
Other reporters, yourself, and he would find something. He would draw a bead on something, and then, as his wife Ronnie Eldridge told me, he then would have to go and see it. In other words, Now I think people are quite comfortable in opining from their offices, but Breslin felt the need to bear witness, and I think that made his stuff rise to a different level. It was superior.
And it rose to a different level, and he found people on the scene that no one else would have found or no one else would have thought to look for. The John Lennon murder, the Kennedy funeral. Tell us about some of those things.
Sure. You know, let's just take the John Lennon murder, for example. The call came into his home at around 11:20 at night, and he was in bed. He got into some clothes, raced to the scene, raced to the hospital, raced to the precinct, and then went back to the Daily News and wrote a very powerful piece about the experience of being in charge of the body of a beetle, these two patrolmen, and what that felt like. And he filed it to make the 1:30 deadline in the Daily News, which is astounding. And then, of course, he made a mistake. He says Williams Avenue instead of Willis Avenue, but then he blames someone else in classic Breslin form. He wouldn't own that.
Right, someone who was taking dictation.
That's right. And two things. First, people remember the Gravedigger story. He writes the story about Mr. Pollard, who dug the grave for John F. Kennedy at Arlington. But before that, he had done this brilliant story about the doctor who received Kennedy's body and spent several panicked minutes trying to massage the president's heart, even though the president was dead, while the president's wife was standing there watching. And it is a riveting story. So he does the surgeon story, he does the Gravedigger story, and then this was in late November of '63. It's Thanksgiving time. He's back in New York, and what does he do on Thanksgiving morning? He goes to the automat, and he writes. Really, what he's writing about is a city in mourning, or a country in mourning. But he never says that. He just describes these lonely hearts sitting in an automat on Thanksgiving Day.
Was that the new journalism, or was it really the old journalism?
He always scoffed at the new journalism label that Tom Wolfe and others had applied to what he was doing. He would say, first of all, it was really sports writing, and then he would say...
Which is how he started.
That's right. Then he would say, and the whole idea of going to the loser's locker room rather than the winner's locker room, go to the graveyard rather than to the pageantry of the funeral service. Yeah. So.
He was very prescient about people. As you say, Donald Trump, he called his number very early on. Rudy Giuliani, I remember he said he was a man in search of a balcony, one of the great phrases of all time. What was it instinctively? He was a kid from Queens. Why was he so instinctively aware of what people were all about?
I don't know. He said that what motivated him and what motivated any good columnist was rage. And I think that he felt strongly the challenges of the disenfranchised, and he distrusted the powerful. And his wife told me that when he would go out and see, say, a murder scene or go into a tenement in a poor neighborhood and really feel and truly empathize with what he was witnessing, he would go back, write the column, and then he would take to his bed. He would really feel what was being experienced by others, and I think that is one of the reasons we're talking about him today.
And he would feel that rage and anger that nothing was being done about it.
Right.
Although one of the things, as we said earlier, is his columns did have impact. When he talked about something, people listened, people in City Hall, people in government listened, and I'm not sure that happens anymore. I remember he did a lot of columns on the Concorde, the SST, landing at Kennedy Airport, and in a stroke of something or other, he said he was going to Europe, and I booked him on the Concorde coming home, and I wanted to make sure he got home in time to write a column for the first edition, and I called I guess it was British Airlines, and said, "How's the plane doing?" And the guy said, "Well, I've got good news and bad news for you. The plane has landed, but it's landed in Nova Scotia, not at Kennedy Airport, because it had a mishap. This is the first time the Concorde didn't land where it was supposed to land." And I said, "My God, how could you ask for anything more?" And Jimmy Breslin was on it. And there was a picture of him that came over the wire in black and white, but you could see Jimmy's face was green in that photograph because he was obviously terrified of being in this sardine can of a plane. But I don't think he ever quite forgave me for that.
Yeah. Also, we haven't really talked about his use of humor. And I think his use of humor and signaling to the reader that, we're all just fools on this earth, really resonated with, the working class guy in Ridgewood or the woman who's cleaning offices in Lower Manhattan. Like, he was able to meet people where they were, and he did it with rage, but he also did it with humor and insight.
Did he lose credibility because of some of the characters he made up, who in fact were not really made up? I mean, Klein the lawyer, Inocchio, Marvin the Torch, they were actually real figures.
Yeah, the only one, right, he had several, Fat Thomas, these were real people. The only one that is a little, we don't know who this person is Inocchio. Right?
I thought he was Fat Tony Salerno.
Oh, I don't know. All right, there you go. That would have been the mob boss. Who he basically ridiculed.
Right, had the big dog. I forget what kind of dog it was.
I think.
Wolfhound.
That's right, the wolfhound. Right. Well, on the other hand, Joey Gallo did in fact have a lion on a leash. But I think that the way he wrote those stories about Fat Thomas and Klein the lawyer, the readers were in on the joke. Do you know what I mean? He was being a little hyperbolic here and there. It's a real person, but he's having a laugh, and everyone else is having a laugh with him. But then, when he is witnessing the assassination of Robert Kennedy, or he's there when Malcolm X gets shot, he was a witness to history in so many ways. They're unimpeachable accounts.
Ed Kozner in the Wall Street Journal, reviewing the book that you edited, said the magnificent journalism Breslin produced in his long career amounts to a pocket history of our times, and it certainly did. You had to write his obituary for the New York Times. How do you write an obituary of someone you know well and know about his work?
I think it's what we journalists do all the time. We set aside our emotions, whether you're writing about 9/11 or Hurricane Katrina or something along those lines. You sit at the laptop and you set aside your emotions and you focus on what's in front of you. And it was this larger than life personality who had a profound impact on me as a young man and as a journalist and the country. And then after you're done, and the editor says this works mostly, it's not Breslin, but it works, then you go and you have a cry or a beer.
There were a lot of columnists around, Pete Hamill, Jim Dwyer, Mike McAlery, others at the time. What made Breslin so special?
I think he was really a poet at heart. He had this kind of personality that he had created of being a hard-drinking boor, but in fact he was
really a softie.
He was a very, very soft heart and would take care of people who were sick, visiting them in the hospital and everything. So so there's that, but also his use of language. If you go back, as I did, and read the stuff, he's very specific in his language, hard-hitting, wasting no words, and oftentimes simple. There's no need for elaboration. There's no need for adjectives. He is like hitting you one after another with images that are hard and constructed well, and you come away and you feel it.
Beautiful. Dan Barry, the book is Jimmy Breslin, Essential Writings from the Library of America. Thank you for joining us. Coming up next, my thoughts on how New Yorkers communicate. If out-of-towners don't always understand New Yorkers, it's not just because we talk fast. More languages are spoken here than any place else on the globe. This is the most linguistically diverse city in the world. By one count, some 800 languages are spoken in the city. In the public schools, you might hear as many as 180. At last count, Queens residents listed some 140 languages that they spoke regularly at home. What's even more fascinating, as I reported in the Times a few years ago, is that some foreign languages are now spoken more widely in New York City than they are in the countries where they originated. That's true for a number of reasons. Members of minority groups confronted with discrimination, hunger, genocide often flee as refugees together. Driven out, they depopulate their ethnic enclaves back home. Typically, immigrants from a region or town gravitate to the same neighborhoods here. The first generation finds English too difficult. The second and third generations sometimes looks to preserve what's left of their heritage, which is why the chances of overhearing a conversation in Vlaški are greater in Queens than in the remote mountain villages of Croatia, where the language originated, or Garifuna, which originated with descendants of African slaves shipwrecked in the Caribbean. Today, it's almost as common in the Bronx and Brooklyn as in Honduras and Belize. The search for those languages and the campaign to keep them alive is described in a new book by Ross Perlin. It's called Language City: The Fight to Preserve Endangered Mother Tongues in New York. It's reviewed by Deirdre Mask in this week's New York Times Book Review. She describes Language City as a deft refutation of the parable of the Tower of Babel. You remember, God disapproved when the people of Babel were building a tower that would reach to heaven. He confused their language so they would not understand each other. Then he scattered them over the earth. Far from scattering, the Times reviewer wrote, people have instead converged on the city, bringing their words with them, and New York's towers have never risen higher. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.